Hello, I think a couple of more people are trickling in, but I want to go ahead and say welcome to tonight's reading. My name is Hannah V. Warren, and I curate the Avid Poetry Series. We're so happy to virtually host Sumita Chakraborty and Christopher Kondrich tonight. Avid Bookshop wants to extend their greatest thanks to all of you who continuously show up and support our small locally owned businesses and authors who have had 2020 and 2021 publication dates. It's been a really rough time in the poetry community, but we're happy to have events like this one to let us know that people are still writing, still producing beautiful art, and that's what brings us together. I do have a couple of quick housekeeping notes before I hand it over to Sumita and Christopher. In case you're not familiar with this virtual format, here's a quick rundown of how the next hour will go. Avid is muting and hiding the video input from all guests so we can focus on tonight's presenters. In order to see only Sumita and Christopher on your screen, you can follow these instructions. If you're in gallery view on Zoom, you'll see all participants' screens that should be off at this point. If you click on the buttons in the top right of any participant's screen, you should be able to hide non-video participants. If you do this, your Zoom screen will focus only on Sumita and Christopher, our featured poets tonight. Also, a quick note, we're recording this reading, so email events@avidbookshop.com if you want a link to the recording once it's online, or you can just go to Avid's YouTube channel and find it there. On that note, I'm really happy to hand the night over to Sumita and Christopher, who have graciously offered to introduce one another and chat a bit about their work as they go. I'm really excited about this format. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of the event, of course. And also, just so you know, you're more than welcome to post questions in the chat bar as we go. We hope you do because we want to see those questions, or you can post them at the end of the reading. And I'm handing it over to you, Christopher and Sumita. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hannah. And thanks, Rachel, who is behind the scenes, saving us all from technological doom.
Thank you so much, Hannah and Rachel, and thanks very much to Avid Bookshop for hosting us. I am super excited for this evening. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Sumita, and she will be kicking us off with a poem, and then we will be going back and forth with poems and talking as we go. I first encountered the work of Sumita Chakraborty when I read "And Death Demands a Labor" in the spring 2016 issue of the Adroit Journal. That poem, which went on to become a finalist for a Forward Prize, rattled and haunted me so that I knew from that day on that I would be reading her poems in perpetuity. Her first full-length collection, Arrow, which Alice James Books published last year, is equally as haunting. Its beguiling long poems and sequences abound with the fervor of an arrow just released from a bow. And when she writes in one of the O Spirit poems, quote, "I no longer love. To prove this, I've cut off my hands," end quote, you know that she means it. Sumita Chakraborty writes poems that are prepared to cut off their own hands. They teem with conviction in the power and incisiveness of language, surely, but not certitude. No, they are much too passionate, too mercurial, too enduring for certitude. Though, of course, of this I am certain. Arrow is a book that will last. Sumita Chakraborty is a poet, essayist, and scholar. Her poems have appeared in Poetry, American Poetry Review, Best American Poetry 2019, and elsewhere. And her essays and articles appear or are forthcoming in Los Angeles Review of Books, Cultural Critique, Modernism, Modernity, College Literature, and Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and the Environment, among others. She was the recipient of a Ruth Lilly and Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Fellowship from the Poetry Foundation and has been shortlisted for a Poet Forward Prize. Originally from Massachusetts, she now lives in Michigan, where she is Helen Zell Visiting Professor in Poetry at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was way, way, way too kind. If folks are having trouble hearing me, please mention that in the chat, because otherwise I'll just be talking to myself, and I do enough of that already. So let me just really quickly mention the format. So Chris and I are going to trade off. We're going to alternate poems. We picked 2 poems each to start things off, and then we're just going to throw it to the wolves and improv it from there. I'll be reading a poem now, and then I'll be introducing Chris right after that, although I feel very strongly that my introduction will pale in the face of his extraordinarily kind one. The poem I'm going to start things off with is actually a newer poem. It's not in Arrow, but it is about one of the things that Arrow is most principally about. So Arrow tells really the story of my coming to terms with the aftermath of violence. And in my case, that is for the most part domestic violence and child sexual assault. And essentially, rather than only talking about what it feels like to experience those things, what I was most interested in this book is a question that I'm most interested in life too. The question of how I came to be someone who really valued love and kinship and community, when the ways in which I was first introduced to all 3 of those subjects left me mostly, like Chris just pointed out, wanting to cut off my hands and renounce the whole business altogether. So the poem, the book kind of starts in that place, and then hopefully you all will find that at the end it ends up in a different place. And the poem I want to read to you to kick things off is sort of a more meta type poem from a new series I'm writing called The B-Sides of the Golden Records. So for those of you who don't know, the Golden Records were 2 records sent up on NASA's 1977 Voyagers, and they were intended as like a greatest hits of humanity, right? They had like, and also just like an intro to what humans were in case the spacecraft encountered any extraterrestrials. So I'm writing a series of poems about the kinds of things that they did not include on the Golden Records, one of which is post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's how the circle meets the square. The B-Sides of the Golden Records, track 5, post-traumatic stress disorder. Before you begin, please be aware that this track does not end. Find a large, unframed mirror, or if you don't have mirrors, find something like one, smooth, flat, and reflective with superstitions silvered in. Beat it with the most vulnerable part of your body. If you're having trouble deciding what to use, ask yourself, what would you least want me to touch? Continue until the mirror breaks, then continue until it breaks many times. Continue until you can tell that your body part is badly hurt. Keep going. When you regain consciousness, resume. On the 6th day, stop. Search for the brightest, clearest light you can imagine. The light should at first feel welcome and joyous, and then, as you realize that it is slightly more garish than you would like, and moreover that it never fades, it riddles your body with a ringing. Carry each fragment, shard, and piece into this light. Do not clean the parts. Arrange them into a shape resembling the original shape of the mirror. If you are not already naked, become naked now. Lie on the fragments. Try not to add more injuries to your body. Feel the light reflect into heat. As you blister, consider the way that on Earth, every night, in the absence of sunlight, tree branches move up and down so that the water inside of the trees keeps moving, creating a kind of heartbeat that is surer than any you will ever know. I can't remember when I first encountered Chris's poems, and I've been trying to rack my brain to remember when that was. I think part of that is because they always felt in some way to be speaking so closely on like a cellular level to the kinds of things that draw me to the page too. In lieu of a origin story, I'll give you some lines I've loved for a long, long time. This is from Chris's poem, Schedule for Burning. We get to lean into the fire to find the fire on our faces. We get to grasp a part of an indefinite figure and picture the whole it's a part of, ribbons of the night's black hair. We get to stay up past burning, linger in the breath of the fire, which we inhale and love, having wayward love and so much of it that it turns inward and is lost. Friend, if you are there, come to meet me. I am drifting, devoured. I am ready to say goodnight. If you'd come meet me so I can release it. Chris's poems are preoccupied with and obsessed with love, with the feeling of having been devoured by something that is later recollected along the lines of what Wordsworth said, but with a twist, not quite in tranquility, but in some different place. So that devouring, that burning has brought the speakers to that they wouldn't even have been able to imagine before the earth-shaking incident. And I think that's one of the things I love so much about them. They're poems that are willing to dive into the wreck, as Adrienne Rich said, but they're also not poems that will let themselves remain wrecked. They're ones that insist on a kind of vision for salvation and solid ground somewhere, even if that's not a fantasy to which the speakers can always give in. Chris is the author of Valuing from the University of Georgia Press, selected by Jericho Brown as a winner of the National Poetry Series and by Library Journal as a Best Poetry Book of 2019. Valuing has also been chosen as a finalist for the Believer Book Award in Poetry. In addition to a starred review in Library Journal, Valuing has been reviewed widely and featured widely. He's also won the Iowa Review Award, as well as the Paris American Reading Series Prize and 3 Pushcart Prize nominations. Recent poems appear in a bunch of places, including the Academy of American Poets Poem a Day, The Believer, Bennington Review, Conjunctions, Crazy Horse, Harvard Review, Kenyon Review, and the Paris Review. He's also the author of the book-length poem Contrapuntal, which came out from Free Verse in 2013 and was a finalist for the New Measure Poetry Prize. The recipient of fellowships from MacDowell, from the Hambridge Center of Creative Arts and the iPark Foundation. He received an MFA from Columbia and a PhD in English and Lit Arts from the University of Denver. He's currently an associate editor for 32 Poems, and he lives in Maryland. I'll turn it over to you, Chris.
Thank you so much, Sumita. That was so lovely. And I want to start with a poem that is the first poem in Valuing. And I think that this poem in some way connects a little bit to Sumita's Golden Records, the B-sides poems that she's writing. Insofar as, when I think about what is sent into space as a representation of what is, here on Earth, right? It's all about what we place value on, right? What we are choosing to include is just as important, as Sumita points out, as what we don't choose to include. So, I think that kind of impulse is something that when I was working on these poems in the book, that I was very much interested in trying to dig pretty deep into, and just sort of try to uncover how and why we place value on things. So I will start with the poem Asylum. I choose to love the dawn. It speaks in light. Long had its silence silenced me. I choose to love this table where I lie, the instruments that tell me what I am made of. I am made of things I love. The onlookers peering over, trying to find somewhat of them, maybe a gem or pencil they once held, maybe a vein like their veins or their sleep. I choose to love our auspices because they brought us here, to love disobedience because it chose the freedom to love or not love, or value. I choose to value. I choose to love as asylum from that which presses me to hate, this body, which is not a body, this representation, which is all there is. I have a choice in the matter. To touch you, I choose my hands. So I believe that I'm going to throw it back over to Sumita to read another poem.
I love that poem. Can I just turn it back to you to read that poem again? Or no, I'm supposed to do things. Yeah, so this is the second poem that I picked. And after this, I will be out in the Wild West improving stuff. I think Chris has one more planned one. And when I read Asylum, thinking about how I might respond to it, one of the things I really connected to this time was its kind of investment in looking around and drawing in whatever fragments of the world seem to make the most sense and have the most appeal, and seem to be things to value and to cherish in a world at large. So that reminded me of a poem I have here in Arrow called Windows. And this poem is a little bit unusual because it is made up of a number of really brief sections, and it doesn't have too much narrative. Well, no, it doesn't really have any narrative in it, although I find little stories in it every time I read it. So I'm excited to see what it'll tell me. It was made out of kind of erasures that I wrote of translations of some of Rilke's late French poetry. In addition to domestic violence, one of the other things that this book is invested in is thinking about mourning and grief. My sister died in 2014, and many of the poems in this book are grappling with that. This is one of them. And it actually, my process of translating started as a way of jumpstarting my brain in the immediate aftermath of her death. And that ends up being a kind of predominant concern that leaks through many of the fragments too. So it's called Windows. How much loss gains suddenly in emphasis and brilliant sadness, far from that which lives and turns. Languages of our vain comings and goings wilt and gnaw, beat them, punish them for having said and always said, tear out finally our spells. One life pours and grows impatient for another life. And the lovers look on them there, immobile and frail, pinned like the butterflies for the beauty of their wings, too great in the outdoors. Like the lyre, you should be rendered a constellation, like the scales or the lyre, an almost name of the age's absences. Should I defend myself? Am I not intact? One who loves is never beautiful, tender, strained. All hazards are abolished at the middle of love with a little bit of space around it where we are the masters, changeable like the sea, ice sudden where our face is mirrored, traverse, taste of freedom compromised by the presence of fate. For whom would I wait? With this heart all full, which loss completes, will I be found when the night abounds, given over to you, inexhaustible, climb, turn far and away, doubt that you can give the excess which arrests me, the sky, an immense example of depth and height, make of the air a round arena, effort circumscribes our life enormous, stretched toward the night what escaped, set out in type on the page, a little image, vague, like the greyhounds arranging their legs, the sense of our rights, waits, intent. Who rushes, who tilts, who remains after the abandonment of the night, starry, avaricious, all the grand, unbroken numbers that the night will multiply, new celestial youth, the matutinal sky buckles close under the guise of tenderness, time uses his jacket. Inconsolable space turned me into wind, placed me in the river, leaves fled. I had drunk all of my abyss. One must not tire and eat with one's eyes. Vision watered profusely, a garden of images. Each bird whose flight crosses my expanse, nothing but looking seems like life to me. Nothing but looking seems like life. While the prunes ripen, oh, my eyes, eaters of roses, you will drink the moon. I consent and I consent. Force, oh, force does not frighten me anymore because it cradles me in the morning, small, wild, become almost a mouth. all worn and bloodless, be stars the rhymes found at the ends of end, say enough. Back to you, Chris.
Oh my gosh. You just like flung it back in my direction after such a poem. I want to just linger with it. Yeah, so for those of you who don't yet have Arrow, Windows is broken up into these sections, and you know, maybe Sumita, we can talk about this a little bit later. You know, this choice to not read it, what, you know, with identifying the change in the sections. And you know, when I'm encountering this poem on the page, I'm definitely feeling very much a kind of tension between sections, the sort of pull, the push and pull of wanting to allow the sections to bleed into one another, but also the impulse to really sit with one on its own. So that is the sort of aspect of Windows that I wanted to respond to, and to read a poem in 3 parts called Black Paintings. And I am going to share my screen. The poems respond to 3 of Goya's Black Paintings, and I definitely want to have those images present and while I read the poems. And as you'll hear, the opening poem is very much thinking about the ways in which we sever and sort of how we sort of respond to that, and how do we sort of regain a sense of continuity. So I'm about to share my screen, and you will see the first poem, the first black painting poem is Fight with Cudgels, as you'll see here. To collapse means to crumble, but also to compress remnants into the remembrance of a whole body this person was. Now it is broken into its swinging and what it swings, a cudgel that continues its arc to strike another face, turning it to the other side of the coin. Can it be this gets him closer to the assemblage of his legs that began pieced together to prop him up? Even living with a right arm, he has a feeling of the left that was severed by the assemblage of a dam at his elbow, that portions of the flow of his forearm and upper arm, the cudgel in the hand, is swinging severed because it is loosed by what it does. The sentence describing violence has no words. The second section responds to Saturn devouring his son. I apologize for the grotesque. That is quite the sight to see. The corroded old doorknob comes off in my hand, like the sentence comes off in my eyes. As I read, I am removing the head from the page, my sight trailing off in dull sudden. The dark has a tendency to do what light does, to offset its subject, give it a voice to emerge from, as if that voice were landscape. We live in this landscape because we live out our days as the body that Saturn lives up to his mouth, not moving, but moving unmoved by our plea to remit, repay what was lost of our limbs that were loaned to us at birth. We determine the value of a thing by how much we owe to those who remove it. The third and final poem in the Black Painting series is actually something that I've never read out loud. Anyone, yeah, I've never read this in a reading, and I always avoided it because it ends in a really vulnerable place, and I'm human. I like to shy away from being vulnerable. And the painting that this is in response to is called A Pilgrimage to San Isidro, which you are seeing right now. Order is to progression as order is to rest, in our reliance on things as they are, as you arrange us, and so we must act out our placement accordingly. We breathe what we are. This pilgrimage curling like a wisp of pipe smoke, creating demand for a nose to inhale it, a crowd to inhabit the individual person. What are you but your ration for today, of things happening without your knowledge, in your name? You lead me not out of myself, but further in, to where I brought myself with these arms, if you would return them. This mouth could yawn open, could be a cave for the song that travels by wind to hollow out the face. But let it, Chris. You have to let it. Oh, on that note, I will turn it back over to you, Sumita, and
So I've done this conversation style reading twice before, and a consistent feature of them both that I always forget when I suggest it again is that I just want to listen to the other person. I don't want to say more stuff after that incredible ending. I'm so glad you read that, Chris. Nevertheless, I have a lot of fun with it in no small part because it lets me feel communal again in a way that I think has been sorely lacking in the increased long cordoning of myself in only this little 3 foot by 3 foot area that you're seeing me in right now. On which note, let me emphasize, I just dropped this in the chat. My dirty little secret is that especially as virtual everything goes on and on and on and on, I have an increased fondness for small rooms. So I'm really excited to be with a tight group this evening. And I would love if you all are willing, I don't want to put more impositions on your Zoom virtual life, but if you'd be willing to chime in the chat, I think that would be really great because I'd love to hear your voice. And yeah, I will guilt trip you on that front the same way I guilt trip my students. Okay, so I was saying before we opened up the room that I may read a new poem, and not just like a post-arrow poem, but like a new poem, as in only the two friends who tell me whether or not I'm bad at life have seen this poem. And I think I'm going to do that now because in Chris's last three poems, one of the things that resonated with me the most strongly right now was first the line, the sentence describing violence has no words, which I think is just brilliant. And then the question of what do we do with the vulnerable places into which we have brought ourselves, but nevertheless are kind of terrified of the consequences. Those things are all in the background of this new poem, which in some ways is a response to the aftermath of the aftermath. It's a response to the reception of Arrow, in which I've found that most people, or many people, not most, and maybe not even many, but a great deal of people are fixated on whether or not the facts of the book, like about domestic violence and the specific experiences with it that I talk about in it, whether they're factually true. So I get that question a lot. Is it true? Like, is that really true? And I wrote this poem in response to that. It was also written during that little slice of time when NASA was like, new news about the moon is going to drop on Monday, stand by. And all the poets were losing it, myself very much included, on social media about like what the breaking news about the moon could be. So this poem is called When They Ask, Is It True? I Answer. And I'm going to read that Title again because it flows into the first line, which I think is the first time I've done that in a poem that I actually like of mine. When they ask, is it true? I answer, what more is there to learn about the moon? Listen, you and I both know there's more I could share. I could tell you about the first time I put pennies in my mouth. I could tell you every time I grew or sheared my hair. No, I know. What you want to know is whether I wept, whether I begged. In a few days, the astronomers will tell us what they've learned about the moon. You and I were in this together, our nude breasts pressed against our draftiest windows in the winter. Say the moon has more silt than we imagined. Say it has a mountain. Say baby lions roam its crests in little feline space boots. The things we're closest to aren't easy to name, but that's no excuse. Deimos and Phobos, brothers. Io, a round marble in the cheek of a name. Euclid, too dim to photograph, too small. Still, we named her. Ours, though, we named it Moon. Like Holly Golightly naming her cat Cat. Have you put a name on my child mouth? If you were asked to give our moon a name right now, right this minute, what would it be? Whoever told us we have the right to learn anything about the bodies for which we never even imagined a name. Thanks. I hope that didn't suck. I'll kick it back to you, Chris.
Oh my gosh. No, that was just incredible. And I don't know what to do with this moment because yes, so I would love to respond to a thread in that poem of a kind of tension between naming and namelessness and trying to locate and name something. I'm going to read a poem called Forced March. It's not in valuing. I'm not sure if it will ever be in a book because the manuscript that I was writing that this was a part of, I abandoned. But it does appear in The Believer, and there is a kind of friction that is there when a person is not named. Well, you'll see. This poem is after Dan Beachy Quick. There is a passage in his really incredible book of Silence and Song in which he describes briefly a particular scenario. That was a scenario that I couldn't quit from my head, so I wanted to think through it in a poem. Forced March. The difference between marching and walking is the order. To depart from the barracks, automatic rifles behind us. Around their stocks and grips, their barrels and magazines are the hands of guards. One of whom shouts from the muzzle of his mouth, not a name, not one of our names, just you. It is as if he has rolled a boulder away from the entrance of a cave and waits for one of us to walk inside, to succumb to the curiosity of knowing who is being called. Dear Lord, it is as if you gave us free will only to know its absence, only to feel it being punctured by the free will of others. Instead of stepping out of line, I pray into this lingering you, which sounds like bread because I am hungry, almost like my own name, which I have tried but cannot eat. You, the guard shouts again, hey you, And this time, one of us turns to face the guard. He steps out as though into a clearing without the cover of understory to see whether the you the guard calls out is the same his daughter touches when her lips would meet his cheek, which of course it is. So the guard raises his rifle, aims it at the man's body, and shoots him. Sumita.
So you're doing the quick toss it back to thing now, aren't you? All right, that's called revenge. That's called revenge. I don't know what the hell I'm going to do next. All right, that was amazing. Thank you so much. I must have read that poem at some point, but you mentioned it wasn't in Valuing, right? Because I think it's been a minute since I've seen it. Thank you. I think, yeah. You know, what's really interesting about that is that I think that that poem and the poem that I read before have a lot in common, actually. And one of the things that they have that's a little bit more surprising that I hadn't expected to think about right now was that idea of the you, right? And like trying to account for the person on the other end of an utterance and trying to hail them too, right? Like, and there's in critical theory, there's this idea of interpolation, which is when you kind of become who you are to another person because they say, hey, you. And in that act of being like, hey, you, they make you into someone. And it kind of feels like both the poems that Chris and I each read talked a little bit about what happens when you're made into something by someone else. So I'm going to continue that thread a little bit. And I think, Chris, just for time management, what I think I'll do, this will be the last improv-y one, then I'll kick it to you for another improv-y one maybe, and then I'll do my last one, and then maybe you do your last one. Does that sound right? Or is that, can you unmute yourself so that we can talk logistics?
No, that's totally fine. Yeah.
Or if you just want to do
I
one
mean, if
more,
you
that's up to
want,
you.
I can just do one more poem.
I was just saying, if you wanted to do that, that's totally up to you. Yeah, that's fine with me. So I'll do one improv-y, then you go to wherever, and then I'll close it out. And Rachel, that'll be the last poem. Sounds good? All right, sweet. So the poem I'm going to do, I don't usually read this poem at readings either, because similarly, it is vulnerable. So I will take up the mantle of Chris's huge gift of his own vulnerability and do the same thing and read this poem called "O Spirit." It takes work for a woman to welcome a fist with her body. Fists are larger than the spaces they make for themselves in a chest or the holes into which we welcome them with longing. Asking whether I wish for one now because I knew them well as a child is like asking if a volcano expels lava, because when a small mountain cloistered within sea waters, its first experience of heat was unbidden. The question requires a certain old knowledge of safety to ask. What does it mean that the first time you saw a cock, it was raised in menace from a boil of shared blood? The question says, tell me the origin story of pain, and tell me what happens to pain as it ages, and tell me how the ocean bottom dirt you grew from tastes. Volcanoes understand differences in kinds and in chords. The origin story of pain is abjection foisted. Not a single stream of lava is like one that has come before or will come since. All my lips make treacherous lights float in midair. Rainey, maybe skip that one when you read Arrow to the 2-year-old? I'll kick it back to Chris on that note.
Oh my gosh. I love that poem, and it's just haunting in ways that are just indescribable. And I'm kind of a little bit at a loss as to trying to select a poem to end with. But so I will end with the poem that Sumita requested that she hear, because that seems like a good as place as any. And in the, I'll just offer one last bit of vulnerability to the vulnerability spirits that we've been conjuring. So little known secret about this book. There are 3 degree of nothing poems, right? I don't do that with any other title. But here's the thing. I don't remember why I titled them Degree of Nothing. I don't remember. People ask me all the time. It's like the number one thing people, I don't know. I feel like such an idiot. Nevertheless, Degree of Nothing. Let one not fool you. We're subject to worlds, and they pull on the eye with their gravities. I sway past persons calling me home. There is no one home. I am walking to another. I am walking down the corridor like water fills whatever this is, burning me when I touch it. Its slender face carved by wind is addressed by a face it cannot see. Mountains are made so that things fall off. When I fell at your feet, you were not there. I wasn't going to listen to my voice, but then I thought maybe it was yours. Maybe the front of this building is the side I'm on. The hull of a body can be a shore or a zero. Every zero wraps around like an echo, a prodigal son. As I walk inside the zero, there is a concentration of everything I end up calling leaves.
See,
So,
now,
to you.
now I can get revenge to you for getting revenge on you for getting revenge on me by, at the end, during the Q&A, start the Q&A by being like, so Chris, the Degree of Nothing poem. So it was like behind the title there. Now I know. Now I know it's going to happen at some point. Hey, thank you all so very much for being here tonight. I really appreciate it. And truly, there's something just really, really magical about a tight Zoom room that genuinely reminds me more than any other big event of being in a small bookstore. Avid Bookshop is one of my real life favorite bookstores. I lived in Atlanta for 7 years and got to do a reading there in the before times. I bought a feminist AF desk plate, which I forgot to rescue from my work office. I think about it more frequently than I possibly should. I miss it. I miss traveling. I'm really very grateful to be here. And thank you all, including especially Rachel and Hannah and Chris, for creating this event and letting us have this time. This will be the last poem. It was by Chris's request, so if you hate it, go ahead and take that up with him. And it's also the last poem in Arrow, so hopefully, especially having started with some of the sharper poems, you'll kind of get a sense of that journey toward accepting love, or even like a quieter, more capacious place from where this last poem in the book leaves us. It's called O. Stars are not the end, but the beginning. A bird is to its throat as a promise is to its sharp edge. I wanted to make for you a sun shower. Instead, I've made for you a mortal thing. Writing is knowing how to cut. There is a space in my body that did not exist when I began this book. It is a window. When I next speak, I will do so through that window. Please leave the window unlatched. When I next speak, it will be with changed lips. I wonder what their color will be. Finally, she enlarges the figure to a grand scale and cuts off its head. Thank you all so much. Can't wait to talk about your questions.
Thank you both so much, Christopher and Sumita. I love that we've ended your reading with a beheading. That is so incredibly exciting to me. I love the vulnerability that both of you had in your poetry. I love the language. All of it was so beautiful and grotesque at the same time, and it was so good. I love how this forum allowed you both to talk about craft alongside your poems. We're going to take a couple of minutes for Q&A right now. To all of the listeners, remember the chat option is open, and I'm happy to share your questions with our poets. But we do have a couple of questions that are already there, so I'm going to read those out to you. I'm excited to hear you talk about them. This is from George David Clark. Chris and Sumita, both of you write longer poems as well as lyrics, and I'd love to hear you each talk a little about what you can accomplish on a larger canvas. How does a poem like Previously Forgotten find its form, Chris? What strategies are you using to make a poem like Dear Beloved cohere as you're conceiving of it, Sumita?
Sumita, would you like to go
Yeah,
first?
sure, totally. Yeah, and first of all, hi David. Thanks so much for coming. It's been a bajillion years. Not that long, although the pandemic feels like it has gone on that long. Yeah, for those of you who may not know, Dear Beloved is a 12-page single stanza poem. So I tend to apologize when I learn that people have assigned it to students. Like I'll do a class visit and I'll be like, oh my God, I'm so sorry that you all had to do that for homework. It was written primarily about the experience of mourning my sister. Dear Beloved, which is the title, is the English translation of her Sanskrit origin name, Priya. And when I thought about that poem while drafting and when the idea for it kind of came to me, I tend to have a really visual imagination. So what I pictured was like a giant monument or like the monolith from 2011 or like a massive grave or something like that. And as you probably know full well by now, after having heard me talk for a little while, things like space and 2001 A Space Odyssey and mourning are the kinds of things that are pretty enmeshed in my deeply visual imaginary. So essentially in terms of making it, I took it brick by brick, like line by line. I would write a couple lines and then I would, when I came back to it, follow those lines in a certain direction. And then I'd be like, never mind, that sucked. That was very boring. Delete them, try again from a different angle. It was a weirdly linear drafting process in that way. And I took it real slow. Like it took me 2 years to write that thing. And then after I had a full working draft that I felt like had at least most of the components that mattered, that's when I went back through and I looked at, okay, are any transitions missing? Spoiler alert, pretty much all the transitions were missing. So there's that. Does it start where I want it to? Does it end where I want it to? That's when a lot of reshuffling of lines took place and writing in of new connective tissue to get from one scene to the next, if that helps at all.
Yeah, I thought that the 4 months that it took me to write Previously Forgotten was a long time. My gosh, 2 years. I will say that I started the poem at a residency, and so I had the idea sort of driving up to this particular remote place, and I just really loved the idea of waking up every morning and returning to a particular thread and pulling on it until I couldn't pull on it anymore. But every single time my brain got tired or something, I just felt like I needed to wake up and do it all over again to see what else the thread was going to pull out. And then I mean, I love poems that sort of push past a page, that push past one idea, that push past one metaphor. You know, the first writing advice that I ever received in a writing workshop was from Marie Howe, and she I don't remember the exact language, but she was pretty much saying that you should be putting everything in the kitchen sink into the poem that you're writing at the time. It could be the last poem that you write. You could walk out into traffic and get struck by a car. don't save it. Do not save it. That writing advice has really stuck with me. I've always loved that. So thanks, David, for the question, and hi.
Can I just pop in though? You went to Columbia, yeah? Did you work with Lucy?
I did, yes, I
So we've
did.
got Lucy Brock-Broido in common because I did her summer workshop in Cambridge. I don't have an MFA, but I lived for a long time, pretty much most of my life in the Boston area, and I did her summer workshop. And she used to mercilessly mock people who needed a staple in their poem. And I've talked about this with like Columbia MFA grade very lovingly. For those of you who may not know, she was like one of the best humans to ever walk the face of this glorious earth. But it's funny that you got that like put the entire kitchen sink in it advice from a poet I love as much as I love Lucy's work, because Lucy was always stressing to me compression. So when I started writing long, it was kind of by accident. And I was like, oh my God, what would Lucy think? This better be worth it. And that was constantly like, this better be worth a staple. That's always been a running refrain. Okay, I'll shut up now.
I love
Oh
this.
my gosh, yeah, no, I appreciate that kind of way of approaching composition as well. That that first page has got to be good. That first page has to earn the staple. But my God, the pressure.
You know, why you think it took me 2 years? I'm sure we have other questions. Sorry, everyone, for talking about our old gods.
Michael has a question for Sumita and says that line about what happens to pain that ages really resonates for me with your poem about the golden record B-side and the idea of something sent out or preserved in space. And so Michael's wondering if you can talk for a couple of seconds about how you're working through ideas about memory and permanence.
Oh yeah, that's a really amazing question. Thank you for it. Or rather, really kind and generous response. I think I've always been pretty preoccupied with both of those things. You know, the thing about domestic violence is that no one believes you. At least no one believes the overwhelming majority of people who try to report it. And I think that has really shaped for a very long time my sense that I am one of the few repositories of all that happened in that particular little tiny universe. And that's not 100% accurate, but it's kind of close. My sister died. My mother has moved out, but she's really, I've been parentified in relation to her my entire life, and she is very, very repressive, and I get it. It's a perfectly understandable mechanism in the brain. I just have never had it. I haven't really been. I tend toward a lack of compartmentalization in terms of what's wrong with my brain, whereas like my mother will turn to aggressively compartmentalizing and separating things and dissociating them from the everyday. This has been very much on my mind these days. Actually, I just this week learned that my father, who was one of my primary abusers, remarried a woman. He remarried a white woman, and he is recasting the entire story of his family as one that doesn't have me in it and doesn't have my mother in it and has my dead sister as the child of him and the white woman. So you can imagine like the next book is going to be very much me, very much back on my bullshit. So this idea that like I am responsible for no grand reason or anything, but just because the tiny stories of what happens to tiny people like me, like my sister, like my mother, they matter. They aggregate into what makes up an entire world. So I think that it's always been sort of both a personal and an artistic obsession of mine to create a record that is emotionally precise, even if I'm like talking about the moon or whatever, and it's not literally talking about domestic violence. It has something about a feeling that matters and that I matter having preserved somewhere in a record. So I don't know if that quite speaks to, Michael, what resonated with you, but those are certainly things that I think about memory and permanence, if that helps at all.
Thank you so much, Sumita. We have one final question for the night, but before we get to it, I want to thank Sumita and Christopher so much for joining us with Avid and talking about their work. If you haven't already, remember you can support both these artists and this local bookshop by purchasing their collections through Avid, where you can choose to receive your order by mail or pick it up at their front door and someone will wave at you from inside, which is very sweet. After Sumita and Christopher talk about this final question, we'll wave goodbye and we'll head out for the night. The final question is from Sarah Kirk, and it is, wow, Chris, that line, the sentence describing violence has no words, stunned me. It also speaks to a question forming for you and Sumita. How do you both grapple with writing through trauma, violence, hurt, or into the wreck, as Sumita does astonishingly in post-traumatic stress disorder, when those subjects can often leave us void of language? So this is touching a little bit on what Sumita's already been saying too. And I'll hand the virtual mic back over to our poets. Thank you both so much.
Oh
Yeah,
my
Chris,
gosh.
I feel like I've just been talking a lot. So if you want to take this one first, that would be awesome.
No, I would, since I'd love for you to speak to this first, if you would, and to sort of give me a moment to collect
Yeah, of course.
thoughts.
No, totally. I'm happy to do that. Yeah, so I was just talking about this with my grad students, actually. For writing post-traumatic stress disorder, I accidentally gave myself flashbacks. And the reason I did that was because, and I didn't, I expect that I'll have to build in some self-care stuff, not to sound too like Instagram-y, but seriously, like genuine self-care stuff. Tell people that I'm delving into difficult stuff, flag that maybe I won't be all that productive later in the day, get my favorite like stout ready to enjoy in a leisurely fashion after a day's work of like walloping my brain. Usually I expect that because I do write about things that are not easy to talk about at all. For that poem, I didn't see it coming. And the reason is because I wasn't writing about a topic. I was trying to pin down precisely what it feels like and trying to pin down precisely how to explain that to some alien, right? An extraterrestrial, which is not that different. I should have thought about this in advance. It's not that different from the experience of explaining it to any other person, because you think like, oh, an alien may not have the same body as you, but no one has the same like body as another person, right? So I guess I would say that in that case, that was a good example of a recent moment where it took me by surprise. And what I did in response to that was, I think that the most important thing that I foregrounded for myself when it took me by surprise was that I wasn't doing it for anyone else. I was doing it for me. This is my subject. These are my archives. I was driven to write about it for a reason that mattered to me. So then it feels a little bit less like you're giving yourself mercilessly at the altar of difficult subjects that you're beholden to, and more like you're making something out of what was given to you to make with, if that helps at all. And then, yeah, don't discount all the regular self-care stuff. Like, we don't write from the neck up. We're like full human bodies. So, I mean, I drank a bunch of stout and I lifted weights because that's what I do, because I'm the secret jock in an artsy intellectual's body. So that's like, take care of like the things that matter to you and do them, and do it for you in a full sense of your ownership of your material. I went on longer than I'd intended to, but it's a doozy of a topic, Chris. Is that I hope
It
I didn't.
really is. Yeah, I mean, I will just say that, it's the sentence describing violence has no words. I mean, I think that in some ways you can take that literally, that in some ways one's experience of violence and trauma is inarticulatable, and that needs to be articulated as well. But I mean, I think that I've written poems that have more explicitly dealt with the pain of others, and I think that I left those poems you know, on my computer. I didn't want to share them with anybody because I didn't feel like it was my place to speak for them. And I think that there comes a responsibility with writing about pain that you don't experience. I mean, surely that there is a lot of pain and valuing that I experienced, emotional pain, but you know, when it comes to writing about the pain of others, I think that you really do need to think about your motives, not just in writing it, but also then in sharing it with others, and thinking about sort of that, you know, you're never going to be the sort of have a definitive word about a particular thing, you know, and I so sorry, I'm sort of fumbling because it's a really hard topic to talk about. But it's something that I think about a lot in terms of when we are writing about violence and trauma in the world, it needs to be not something that you want to exploit. It is not there for you to write about. If you write about it and it gets you to a place where you're thinking more in a more nuanced way or a more complex way about the ways in which you can put good into the world, then I think that that is a good thing. But you know, I think with writing about violence and with writing about trauma comes responsibility, and I will leave it at that.
That was really beautiful. Thank both of you so much for answering these questions so generously and so openly. I know everyone here really appreciates it. I know I do. This has been so great. We're going to go ahead and say goodnight to both of you and to all of our listeners here. And we look forward to reading your poetry and everything you put out from here. Thanks so much, both of you.